Well, hello again. Welcome to Horror in Detail. Today we are going to share Wendigo encounter stories. First story. This story was shared by you/Wellregard. The Cult in the Woods. So there's this story about these woods in a place near where I'm visiting. I'm in a small town in Alabama visiting family. There is an entrance and two clearings in a forest near my house. Back a few years ago, my friend Tyler and I heard a story about this little girl being murdered. I had a hard time believing that. Well, the 9 and 11-year-old Tyler and I went into the woods. We saw two clearings. One was full of tire rims and bricks. The other was relatively clean for a forest. It smelled like roses. We were walking back, and it got dark. Before I continue, let me give you a backstory. There was a man and his daughter who went into the forest. The man told his daughter to wait where the second clearing was. He came back, but hitting her with a car, killing her. Where the first clearing, closest to the road is where he stopped and committed suicide. When it got dark, Tyler and I had stopped. We felt painful scratching at our ankles and shins. We ran as fast as our 9 and 11-year-old legs would let us go. Wood's cabin. When we got home, Tyler went to his grandpa's house, which was right next door. We went to sleep after texting about that for an hour after that. We woke up, went out by the fence, talked and played Monster Hunter Freedom Unite on our PSPs. After we hung out, we told each other we would never go back there again. But now I'm 14, and Tyler is 16. I'm still as dumb, so of course, I went back there. So, as I was going through the clearings, I smelled the faint aroma of roses in the last clearing. I decided that this was enough, so I started walking back. I noticed something that I didn't notice when I was first walking in. A cabin-like structure. It filled me with a fear I'd never felt before. When curiosity fell over me, I walked over. The crunching leaves and sticks felt like it added to the surreal feeling that shrouded me. I went and looked at the cabin. I noticed one of the tire rims from a few years back. It was nailed to a small, skinny tree. Wood's tire rim. I was getting anxious, so I ran as fast as I could. I'm glad I ran as a sprinter on the track team, haha. I ran not only as I was terrified of the building, but the dark red robe I saw in the distance. A lot of the tree tops started rustling, and that's what motivated me to get my ass out of there. After I left, I made a note with a crimson hand print. I wrote, "We know." A pretty crappy Elder Scrolls reference, I know. After 3 days, I went back and nailed the note to another skinny tree near the cabin. Then, I waited. 2 weeks. I came back after the wait. When I was trekking through, I almost activated something. It was a tripwire. There were 2 beer bottles tied to it, a brown one, and a white one. I went to investigate the place, when I saw they built more things, and that the note I left was gone. I took some pictures, and ran, as I felt anxious again. Later that night, I was having a hard time sleeping, even though I was sharing a room with my 21-year-old brother who helps with the babies. Later, at around 2 o'clock in the morning, I looked outside. There were 2 people walking down the street. The streetlight illuminated the 2 people. I nearly yelled when I saw something that scared the living hell out of me. 2 red robes. Second story. This story was shared by you/LifeEstrangement. My wife and I found a door in the middle of the woods. What the hell? What is it, honey? My wife's voice called out from behind me. It's a door. She laughed. Did you break into the pot stash early? We're in the middle of the woods, why would there be a, oh, huh. Karen stopped as she saw it, and we stood shoulder to shoulder looking at it, an old wooden door built into the side of a hill in the middle of nowhere. It really is crazy what you can find out on these expeditions sometimes, huh honey? She grinned. Should we knock? I shook my head. I'm not really sure I want to meet the kind of person that lives inside a hill. Oh come on. Karen punched my shoulder. Where's your sense of adventure? Karen strode up to the door and gave it a polite knock. Hello, I'm looking for a Mr. Beard, a Mr. Treebeard. I chuckled as I shook my head. Karen never let me forget the little wonderful things about her that made me fall in love with her. She turned to me in mock disappointment. I don't think anybody's home, honey. She said. All right, come on. I said. We've got enough shrooms for now, let's find a good place to trip. Are you kidding? God, I married the most boring man in the universe. We've got to go inside. What if someone lives there? What if somebody lives in a hill in the woods? I think the man who built his house underground in a forest will be understanding if we offer to share some of our pot with him. You assume that just because he lives in a hill he smokes pot. I don't know, Karen, that's pretty racist. Racist? Against who? Tree people, obviously. Who else? Karen laughed and punched me in the shoulder again. I feigned being hurt, even though I loved it when she did that. All right, I finally agreed. After all, if I didn't completely ignore common sense sometimes, I wouldn't be married to you in the first place. You're really funny. After I kick you out of the house, maybe you can live with Mr. Treebeard out here in the woods. I chuckled and tried the knob. The door was unlocked. As we pushed it open, we were greeted by a damp, mossy smell. The room inside was pitch black, but it seemed to be made entirely of rock, not dirt like I had expected. Hold on a second, I said, sliding the pack off onto the ground and fumbling around inside for the flashlight. I flipped it on and scanned the walls. What the? The walls were all covered in some sort of nonsensical carvings. It reminded me of when we'd studied Egyptian hieroglyphics in school. What is this, wingdings? Karen joked. I didn't answer. I had gotten the sudden feeling that I was being watched. I swung the flashlight to the back wall, only to discover that there wasn't one. The passage continued on and sloped downwards until the flashlight beam ended on the ceiling about 30 feet away. Karen, I think we should dash. Hold on, what's that? Karen pointed to a dark spot on the floor, and I pointed the flashlight down to illuminate it. It was some kind of black liquid. Motor oil? I joked. But Karen's wasn't joking around. She knelt down to look at the puddle. It's blood, Danny, she said. And look, it's leading down inside. I tilted the flashlight up. She was right, there was a blood trail leading deeper into the cavern. It's probably just an animal, I said. We should go. But Karen was already tying her hair up the way she did at work. She cupped her hands to her mouth. Hello, she called out. I heard the call echo down the chamber, which must have been much larger than we had originally thought. Is anybody down there? Silence. But then, a barely audible call answered. H, help. The call sounded like it was coming from deep within the cavern. When I heard it, all the hairs on the back of my neck stood up and there was a sinking feeling in my chest. My every instinct started telling me to get the fuck out of this place. Karen, it could be some sort of trap, I said. Let's call the park rangers and then get the fuck out of here. Somebody's hurt down there, Danny, she said sternly. But then her expression softened a bit. Sorry, honey, this is what you got yourself into when you decided to marry a nurse. I sighed. I knew there was no stopping Karen once she had set her mind to do something, but I kept a tight grip on the heavy mag flashlight as we proceeded down the passageway. The blood trail got thinner as we walked deeper into the cavern. Whoever it was must have lost most of their blood in the antechamber. But if they were hurt out there, why had they retreated further into the cavern? Why not go outside where they had a chance of being found? It didn't make any sense. The air grew hotter and more humid as we went further down the increasingly steep slope, and a pungent smell of mold invaded our nostrils. I coughed as I breathed the horrid air. Where did all this dust come from? The deeper sections of the cavern walls had been cracked open by tree roots that had burrowed their way through the stone. What the fuck is this place? I whispered to Karen. Maybe some sort of makeshift survival bunker. She guessed. She cupped her hands to her mouth again. Hello. Her shout echoed down the hallway. If you can hear us, stay calm. We're going to help you get out to safety. Help. The voice was a little louder this time. We must be getting closer, I thought. But the sense of revulsion I felt on hearing the voice only got worse. Did she not feel it? As we went deeper inside, we found where the blood trail ended. There was a long smear of it on the ground. It looked like somebody had been dragged across the floor while bleeding heavily. And then it just stopped. Not even a drop after that. The walls of the cavern had now been almost completely overrun by roots, and breathing was getting difficult as the air had grown hotter and more choked with dust. Help. The voice was very close now, and I could now make it out more clearly. It sounded strange, all breathy and raspy, like a crude imitation of what a person should sound like. The floor had now become so steep it was impossible to go any further without risking a fall into God knows what. We've got to get down to him somehow. Karen wheezed out. She must have been having even more trouble breathing in the hot, thick dust than me. I've got it, I said. You step back. I pulled out the length of rope we'd brought in our emergency gear and tied it to one of the thick roots springing through the walls of the cave. I gave it a few firm tugs to make sure it was secure, before tying the other end around my waist. I'd never wanted to turn around and go home so badly, but I knew there was no way Karen would leave without seeing this through. I started the climb down carefully, leaning over and moving the flashlight around to try to see what was going on without slipping and falling. I could see the vague outline of a man in the darkness, and I swung the flashlight beam over him. My blood went cold. Karen, run. What? Run. My breath was knocked out as the rope yanked back against my waist. I hoped it was Karen pulling, but I knew it wasn't. She wasn't that strong. I landed on the ground hard, and the rope continued to pull me backwards. Danny, what the fuck is Dash? Run, god damn it. She started to back away as the roots on the walls all started to move, slowly snaking their way towards us. I sawed through the rope with my pocket knife and stumbled forward into a sprint, yanking Karen along with me. She wouldn't have hesitated if she'd seen what I had. At the bottom of the cavern a man had been suspended above the ground in a giant web of roots that were writhing and sliding through him. Little bulges were moving slowly up the roots that led away from his collapsed and shriveled body, one root jutting into his throat and twisting around every time he called for help. The plant was working his voice box like a puppet. We abandoned our flashlight and gear bag in the cave behind us as we sprinted towards the exit in total darkness, hacking and coughing as the moldy, dusty air of the cavern filled our lungs. I could feel myself tripping on roots that had not been there on the way in. I felt a yank on my hand as Karen fell, and we both tumbled down onto the writhing roots which circled around our limbs and began to drag us backwards. I started hacking desperately at them with my pocket knife. The roots recoiled as I struck them, and I managed to free my legs. I pulled at Karen's hands, but the roots were stronger. "Just leave me," she shouted at me. "No." I swung blindly at her legs, and the knife connected with a sick thud. I swung a dozen more times, slashing her legs once by mistake before she was loose enough to yank free. We kept running towards the door, and I could feel the air getting cooler and fresher, and the floor beginning to level out. We'd almost made it. I could see the outline of light around the door now. We ran full force into it, ricocheting off and bouncing back onto the ground. I scrambled up. "Please be open." I grabbed the knob and yanked, and a torrent of fresh air and sunlight poured into the cavern. I grabbed Karen's arm and half dragged her through open door before collapsing exhausted on the ground. "We made it," I gasped out. My chest was heaving up and down as I lay on my back coughing up all the dust from the cavern air. "Yeah." Karen was bright red with exhaustion, her arms and legs covered in scratch marks. I don't imagine I looked much better. "What the fuck was that?" I said breathlessly, getting to my feet. Karen shook her head. "I don't know, but let's get the fuck out of here." I helped Karen to her feet, and we both stood there panting and coughing with our hands on our knees. Karen coughed something up into her hand. "Danny," she said, showing it to me. It was a small leaf. I watched her face as little green tendrils began to spread out and coil around under her skin, and I realized with horror that it hadn't been dust we were breathing in. It had been spores. Third story. This story was shared by you/Chimman. Been having weird experiences around my house. Could this sound like a Wendigo? First off, this is what happened last night that really freaked me out. I have a back door in my room that leads outside to my backyard. The whole reason I was even wondering about Wendigos is because I live in Native American territory, Blackfoot to be exact. My house is also kind of located more rurally. I'm very close to the woods/mountain range. Anyways, last night around 1 a.m. I had opened my back door for some fresh air since it was a bit stuffy in my room. I stepped out for a sec to smoke a cig real quick, and then probably about 50 feet away I heard something that I can really only describe as sounding like an Aztec death whistle, followed by 2 thumps on the ground. Yeah, that freaked me out, so I ran back inside real quick, lol. My cat, who was laying on my bed, looked absolutely terrified as well. Her eyes were huge and she was just staring outside. I turned on the lights and went to look, and there was nothing there. Note, there is no houses behind mine, it's just the woods/mountains. Not the first time something like this has happened either. From when I moved here I've heard tapping a lot at my windows and doors, even once sounded like someone completely body slammed my back door in the middle of the night. In addition to that, I'll occasionally hear whistling, but pretty faint whistling, at night. I always get kind of bad feelings over my backyard at night. I get oddly paranoid for seemingly no reason. Seems like this sort of thing is getting more common for me too. I'll hear this sort of thing a lot more often, and my little dog literally refuses to go outside at night to go to the bathroom. What does this sound like? I'm not really an expert, but I've learned more about Wendigos and it sounds a bit interesting. Fourth story. This story was shared by you/Blood Off the Forest. The rules of our woods. The path through the woods is so twisted and winding that it doubles back at some points, and at others you could cut out 5 minutes of walking if you were willing to race just a few hundred yards straight ahead. Nobody would, though. Don't be foolish. I had been walking for half an hour when I see a pair of cherries on the path but not touching it. They appear to have fallen perfectly so that their stems are held up gently by ferns. I duck down to examine the berries and find them almost perfect, and I reach my hand to touch it when. Don't pick up their gifts. One of the warnings I've heard all my life rings clearly in my head. Are these fruit really a gift though? There are certainly cherry trees in these woods, and though I can't see any right now, that doesn't mean that there are none close enough for this to be a natural occurrence. I eat the berries and continue on my way. In our village, adults tell children what to do in the woods before they are old enough to venture out there. Before they're even old enough to walk, in some cases. If you take their gifts, listen to the whispers in the forest, insult them or leave the trail for any reason, then you could be taken. Some children who are taken are replaced by false, corrupted versions. Some are merely removed, never to be seen again. They never replaced the adults. As a teenager teetering between childhood and adulthood, I wonder whether their rules would allow them to send a replica back in my stead. I wonder if they would even want to. The whispers started up a few minutes later. I can't remember if they alarmed me the first time, but I've been on this trail many times before today. The whispers are not things that we should listen to, but despite that, or perhaps more likely because of that, they are beautifully melodic. I've heard riddles, insults and compliments over the years, each one in a compellingly sweet tone. I've walked these paths so many times that by all rights I shouldn't have tripped. But whether due to them or my own poor coordination, I fall hard and slide down the slope to the left of the track. No matter how you look at it, I'm definitely off the path now. I hear giggling all around, though I can't see a single source. Oh yeah. You think you're funny. You really think you're clever. Your tricks are stupid and you're stupid and you just dash. The trees creak and I feel the pressure in the air change. The light shifts and I hear a cracking noise behind me. I spin round and I see her. Beautiful, horrific and altogether inhuman. I sob as I fall to her feet. I didn't mean it. I whisper. I didn't mean it. It was just the last rule that I had not broken. I haven't been honest with you, I suppose. Not entirely. I told you of the rules that adults tell children in these parts, and I let you believe that I was told these myself, rather than only ever hearing them from parents who were actually concerned about their kids. I told you how I ate the berries and left off just how much I hoped they were a gift. That I tripped was perfectly true, but the additional truth that I had fully intended to purposefully leave the path at a later point would have shifted the tone somewhat. Why did you come? She asked me. Whilst parents told their children the rules of the woods, what mother who truly cared about their child's safety would not only fail to catch them but actively allow their child to walk this way, time and time again? My mother told me that you take people and send them back all wrong. That a good, pure child had been taken from her and I was sent back instead. There was a pause and I could hear creaking as she breathed. That is not the truth of the matter. I know that. I know it. I have no memories of the woods before the age of 8, and she'd already started telling this story by then. So I know it's just a story and that I didn't come from here. But this is still where I want to be. I'd stopped crying, perhaps because there was no longer any point. I'd made my case and she would either choose to accept me or she wouldn't. This choice cannot be undone, and our ways are not like the ones you've known. We are not what you might consider kind. I shrugged. Neither were they. All children learn the rules of the woods, but so too do all adults. They take alarming truths and flavor them with suspicion and fear. They use stories of the forest to hide truths from inside the village in a place that no neighbor will dare to scrutinize too carefully. It is true that the beings in the forest will steal those who break their simple rules. But it is also true that sometimes, every so often, there are those of us who want to be stolen. Fifth story. This story was shared by you/Theogelstrikes. I know what really killed the old western town of Calico. It came from the mines. My grandfather told me a horrifying story about something that happened in the town of Calico during the dying days of the Wild West. I finally summoned the courage to tell this tale to my grandson, and he insisted that I share it here. I'm not sure that the young boy fully believes me, but he never knew my grandfather. That man was many things, but he did not lie. He could not lie. My name is Elizabeth Langley. I am 82 years old, and I have lived in England for my entire life. I remember, when I was about 8 years old, asking my father about his home. He had a faint American accent, so I knew he had not always lived here. Oakley, California, my father answered. What a place. I miss it. Still, I wouldn't have met your mother if I hadn't moved to England. Why did you move here? Was it the war? I asked. I had always fantasized about America. I longed for the sun-drenched land of California, rather than the bleak remnants of a post-war London. This would have been the year of 1948. I was only a young boy. I must have been no more than 13 years of age when my father packed our bags. As you know, he is a complicated man. He never told me why we were moving. He just said he couldn't do it anymore, my father explained. My curiosity had been piqued. I had expected a simple answer, but my father had only left me with more questions. I knew I had to talk to my grandfather. I had to know more about what happened in America. I think, in hindsight, I would have preferred to live my life without this tale rattling around at the back of my mind. Whether you read ahead is your choice. It's not a story for children, my grandfather told me. Every Christmas, he would come to stay with us. Every Christmas, I pleaded with him to tell me about America. It wasn't until I turned 12 that he finally caved. He realized that I would never stop pestering him, I suppose. My grandfather, Harley, met my grandmother in San Francisco, and they moved to Oakley when my father was born. That didn't answer my question, though. What was so wrong with America? Why did they move to England? There was nothing wrong with Oakley, the dear old man explained to me. There had been nothing wrong with San Francisco, either. What haunted my grandfather was the life he had left behind. He had tried, for years, to flee from it. Nowhere was far enough. Even as he told me this tale, he admitted that traveling to England had never offered the respite he so desperately sought. He said that, perhaps, it was finally time he told somebody his story and lessened the burden. Before moving to San Francisco in 1896, my grandfather had been a prospector. He left home at the age of 16, moved from town to town, and eventually settled in Calico, California. Most Americans have probably heard of this western ghost town, but for those readers who don't know about it, the official story about this boom and bust town is that minerals dwindled, as they did in many western towns. The mines dried up. People moved away. However, Harley always insisted that something else happened in Calico. There was another reason that the townsfolk disappeared. It all started in 1895. My grandfather had already been living in Calico for 3 years. He had become a part of the community. He saw himself as more than a prospector. He had even considered settling there. There were a few handsome women in town that he said he would have considered marrying. He had plenty of friends. He enjoyed a drink or two in the saloon. What more could he want from life? Silver was already starting to lose its value, but my grandfather didn't care. He was only 21 years old in the year of 1895, but he was tired. He wanted more from life than mining for valuable resources. And he believed Calico could become more than a mining town. The silver rush didn't have to be the end of it. He believed it could be a place that people would call home. Obviously, that's not how things turned out, but Harley swore that the end of mining was not the thing that killed Calico. In December of 1895, things began to change in the town. People started to go missing. Any search efforts were half-hearted, unfortunately, as the icy nights deterred most people from exerting their full efforts. They wanted to stay indoors. Harley said that a prospector named Lester Grant talked of something he had found down in the mines. A new mineral. Something that would save the mine and, in turn, the people of Calico. Apparently, the prospector claimed it was something he'd never seen before. Perhaps it was even more valuable than silver. My grandfather and his friend laughed it off. They knew, as did everybody in the saloon, that Lester was a drunkard. He was always spouting nonsense to lighten the mood. Lester, as you might have guessed, was the first person to vanish without a trace. Others soon followed. All sorts of townsfolk. Miners, barbers, bartenders, and even one of the sheriff's deputies. That's when things became more serious. 12 people went missing in the first week. When the sheriff's deputy became the 13th to vanish, that's when the search parties became a little more frantic. One evening, when Sheriff Harper was drinking with Harley and his friends in the saloon, he urged them to not let word spread about the disappearances. He didn't want any outside law enforcement to get involved. The sheriff claimed it was just life on the frontier. There were so many possible explanations. Coyotes. Bandits. People smelling the end of the silver rush, perhaps. My grandfather wanted to favor the latter suggestion. Everybody favored that suggestion. It was better to assume that townsfolk had simply moved away, rather than assuming some harm had come to them. Still, Harley was a wise man, and he could not quite shake the feeling that nobody had left Calico. He couldn't stop thinking about what Lester had said. Harley continued to raise the issue in the saloon, night after night. James implored his friend to stop. He needed the mine. He needed the town. Like most people, James was too fixated on the dying days of the frontier to notice anything else. Another week later, after the total number of disappearances totaled 19 people, my grandfather's nightly saloon talk was interrupted. Martha, the bartender, finished her shift and joined Harley and his friends at their table. They immediately offered their condolences. A few days prior, Martha's sister had gone missing. My grandfather said that the bartender's haunted disposition filled him with great unease. She looked not like somebody in the throes of grief, but somebody with a terrible secret. Still, Martha did not stall. She did not mince her words. She said that she had seen her sister. One of the men at the table excitedly roared that they must notify the sheriff. Martha explained that the man did not understand. The previous night, she stood at her upstairs window and gazed out onto the sandy main road that ran through Calico. There, gazing up at her, was her sister. Only, it wasn't her sister. Not really. It was something in her sister's yellow sundress. My grandfather could remember exactly how Martha described the figure. I, too, can remember the exact wording. She painted a nightmarish picture that is permanently etched into my mind. I could scarcely see her in the moonlight, Martha said. My joy was fleeting. I soon realized that she had no discernible facial features. Just a mouth. A gaping mouth, black as the night. She was emaciated, yet so much taller than I remember. Her dress was torn. I could see so little of her, but I could hear her. Didn't you hear that sound last night? It was an inhuman, whistling scream. It sounded like an animal calling to the pack. Of course, most of the men at the table dismissed Martha, claiming that grief had driven her to lunacy. They hadn't heard a scream. They might have heard a few animals, but they heard no inhuman screams. My grandfather said that James simply looked at him with a pale expression. He whispered to Harley that he had heard a blood-curdling scream during the night. He thought he had been dreaming because it was a sound no human could produce, and it was certainly like no animal he had ever encountered. Harley told his friend that he knew who could help. The next morning, he and James did not join their friends in the mines. They traveled southeast, searching for a small tribe of Native Americans that lived towards the town of Yermo. Harley knew a woman named Anjani, one of the elders. Over the years, he had sold various minerals to her from his prospecting ventures in local towns. My grandfather explained to James that Anjani had told him stories of a terrifying creature. The Wendigo. Martha's sister did not match that description, but the encounter sounded like something beyond the realm of logical explanation. The elder had once told my grandfather that there were things which the white colonizers did not understand. If there were anyone who could explain what Martha saw, Harley swore it would be her. When the two men arrived at the tribal village, my grandfather said that Anjani was already expecting him. She told him that something had been unearthed in Calico. It was an ancient thing that should have been left alone. My grandfather said that, 3 years earlier, the old woman cautioned him against prospecting in Calico. She said that land was fragile. Dark things lay there, and those dark things should not have been disturbed. Apparently, James looked even paler than the night before. My grandfather kept encouraging him to drink some water because he didn't want his friend to pass out on the journey back to Calico. And Harley wasn't finished. He needed to know more. He begged Anjani to tell him what was happening to the people of Calico. My grandfather said the elder was far more terrified about this creature than any of the others she had discussed. She said one word, Daiba. It is a creature worse than the Wendigo, she explained to my grandfather. There is a nameless force deep in the earth that calls out to desperate people. It calls to those who need something, much like the residents of Calico who faced the extinction of their livelihoods. Harley inferred that Lester must have felt this force calling to him. There had never been a magical mineral in the mine that would solve all of their problems. Everybody in Calico wanted more. The force must have been calling to all of them. How long, my grandfather wondered, would it be before everyone was gone? Anjani explained that the thirst cannot be quenched until the victim has become a Daiba. Then, their mortal desires fade away. Instead, they thirst only for souls, draining the flesh and the spirit of all those who cross their path. The elder said it is a fate worse than death. When the soul is drained, the victim is denied passage to the afterlife. My grandfather heeded her warning and dragged James back out to the horses, preparing to race back to Calico. Before he could leave, however, Anjani grabbed my grandfather's wrist and whispered into his ear. She told him that James had the thirst. She could see it. She begged Harley not to follow his friend into the mines. Harley did not reply. He said James smiled weakly at him before kicking his stirrups and commencing the ride back to Calico. My grandfather did not want to believe it. He couldn't believe it. He wanted to save his friend, but he couldn't lie to himself. He knew that James was already gone. His friend had heard the call of whatever sinister force lay deep in the earth, and his thirst would not be quenched until that call had been answered. This one was larger and ghastlier than the sister that Martha had described. From its nondescript shirt and ragged trousers, Harley could not identify which missing town member was stalking the bartender. He said he hardly had time to assess the scene. It was over before it started. The once human creature used its spider-like limbs to move at great speed towards its prey. Moonlight sufficiently illuminated the scene of horror that unfolded before my grandfather. The Diba lunged for Martha with one of the gnarly appendages that used to be its left hand, and it seized her by the throat. My grandfather said the bartender screeched at the top of her lungs, scratching at the Diba's left hand with both of hers, and furiously swinging both of her legs back and forth. It was a fruitless endeavor. Harley knew he should avert his gaze. He knew he should ride away and never look back, but he could not peel his eyes from the scene before him. Raising her off the ground, the Diba moved its right hand towards Martha's face. Suddenly, my grandfather understood what he had seen in the sheriff's office, and he understood what he was about to see. The creature formed a claw shape with its right hand and violently forced its thumb into Martha's right eye socket. My grandfather sobbed profusely as he told me this part of the tale. He said he had never felt so utterly helpless as he did when he watched one of his dearest friends suffer so slowly and agonizingly. Martha's screams grew in volume and ferocity. Harley watched as the creature suspended her in the air with the thumb that had pierced her right eye and released her neck with its left hand. Then, without pause, the Diba plunged its left thumb into her left eye socket. My grandfather assured me that Martha's screaming rivaled that of the Diba. It was almost as horrific. Almost. Lifting her body higher into the air, as if she were a trophy, the creature started to yank its hands outwards. Its thumbs were firmly lodged into the bloody sockets that had once been Martha's eyes. Her screeching grew to an unbearable volume. With an almighty tearing noise, the awful sound of Martha's agony ceased. The Diba stared longingly at the corpse it held in its two hands, and then it began to drink from the canyon it had formed between the two halves of Martha's skull. My grandfather said he uttered a sound. It was involuntary. He had managed to resist the urge to cry or scream, but, at this moment, he gasped. The creature stopped. It turned to face Harley. And that was when it started. What followed was a cacophony of whistling screams. They echoed across the town. Soon, creatures began to reveal themselves from the nooks and crannies of Calico. One of them was wearing a yellow sundress. My grandfather distinctly remembered her. I'm not sure how he made it to his horse, given that everyone else perished. Perhaps the Diba had been busy feeding when my grandfather first strolled through the town. Perhaps he had been fortunate enough to avoid them. Whatever the case, his luck had run out. His horse had been whinnying uncontrollably since he mounted it, possibly only standing still for so long because it was frozen in the same state of fear as my grandfather. At this point, Harley said his stallion seemed only too happy to oblige when he pulled at its reins and steered towards the road that led out of town. As the pair rode back to town, the sun began to set on the horizon. My grandfather said that he felt apprehended by the sudden emergence of Calico on the horizon. Uncharacteristically for that time of night, there was not a single visible light. The town had been engulfed by the night. There was no light, no movement, and no sound. The two men unsaddled themselves and tied their horses to a post. James was shivering at this point, and my grandfather was starting to worry about him. He dipped his head over the doors to the local saloon, peering into the empty building. Nothing. Not a light. Not a sound. Not a person in sight. My grandfather told James that they needed to go straight to the sheriff. Keeping James in his line of sight, Harley led them across the isolated town. When they reached the sheriff's office, they were met with an open doorway. It led into blackness, but there was a kerosene lamp perched on a table in the center of the room. With great trepidation, my grandfather took a few cautious steps inside and called out for the sheriff. There was no response. He tiptoed towards the table in the center of the room, picked up the kerosene lamp, and spun in a circle to get his bearings. What my grandfather said he saw next is something that still chills me to the bone, so I have no idea how horrified he must have felt. It was the sheriff. He was not one of the Daiba. He was not anything. The corpse lay on the hard floor, barely visible in the dim light of my grandfather's lamp. The man was a shell. That's how his corpse was described to me. It had been, much as Anjani said, drained both in flesh and spirit. The sheriff had been reduced to little more than bones with bloody strips of flesh remaining. My grandfather said the skull was the worst part of the scene. The sheriff's skin was mostly intact, though gray and colorless, but his eye sockets were empty, and his skull was split roughly down the middle. Harley vomited. I'm not quite sure how he managed to hold his stomach as long as he did, but perhaps, despite his lengthy, detailed description, the whole ordeal only lasted a matter of seconds. Who knows? I did not want to press him on the matter. I was happy for him to move forwards with the story, though things only worsened. When my grandfather left the sheriff's office, James had vanished, much like the rest of the town. Harley called for his friend, but Calico was silent. Nobody responded. Not wanting to leave his loved ones behind, but understanding that the battle had already been lost, my dear old grandfather accepted defeat and began walking back to his horse, preparing to leave Calico behind. He untied his ticket out of that hellhole, mounted the saddle, and then looked back at the town. I still remember my grandfather's face as he reached this part of the story. The sheer horror. He asked me whether we could abandon the tale there. He said I could simply accept that he left Calico, and surely that was enough. But it wasn't. I had to know. I just had to know. There was a whistling scream. I did not need my grandfather to say any more than that. I knew it was the same as the one that both James and Martha had described. That's when my grandfather saw her. Martha. She burst through the saloon doors and sprinted onto the main road, tripping and falling. Presumably, she had been hiding in the building. My grandfather certainly didn't see her when he peered his head inside earlier, but he definitely saw her as she scrambled across the road on her hands and knees. And he saw the creature that followed her from the saloon, ducking as it slinked through the doorway. The Daiba. There was, of course, one last demon for my dear old grandfather to face before he could leave Calico behind for good. One last creature stood in the middle of the road to freedom. James. My grandfather said he was not surprised to see the gaping black hole of a mouth and those monstrous limbs, but that didn't make it any less painful to witness. Goodbye, old friend. Those were Harley's final words to James as he plowed onwards, head buried in his horse's mane of hair, charging towards his old friend and preparing for the cold embrace of death. And yet, it didn't come. When my grandfather opened his eyes, he was free. His horse had galloped far beyond the boundaries of Calico. Harley looked over his shoulder to see his old friend standing at the side of the road. He had stepped aside to let my grandfather pass. Perhaps James was not quite as far gone as the others. Perhaps he had retained enough of his humanity to resist the thirst just a little longer. Whatever the case, my grandfather survived to tell the horrible tale. Before moving to San Francisco in 1896, he said he traveled back to Yermo to see Anjani, though he steered clear of Calico. The elder said that some of the Calico townsfolk had survived that unspeakable night by fleeing to the hills. She told my grandfather that the Daiba were not seen again. The tribe assumed that the creatures perished, given that they require continuous sustenance. Once the remaining townsfolk fled, the unnatural beings had no way to quench their thirst. They surely perished. That was the prevailing hypothesis. Other than the few Calico survivors and the people of Anjani's tribe, nobody ever learned of what happened in that town. In fact, Calico lasted for another decade. My grandfather explained that many of the townsfolk returned and tried to squeeze the last few drops of life out of the town before it was officially abandoned in 1907. Sometimes, I wonder whether it was abandoned because the creatures returned. Perhaps some of the fools came back because they thirsted for something. Maybe the mines called to them. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.